Oliver stepped onto the plane with a calm, understated elegance, his suit perfectly tailored, his demeanor exuding quiet confidence. His presence was naturally commanding, and as he moved into the first-class cabin, passengers glanced his way, curious but respectful. But Jason, the lead flight attendant, didn't share their reaction. As he caught sight of Oliver, a man of striking success and poise, Jason's expression hardened. He scanned Oliver, mentally cataloging him, a subtle tension simmering beneath his professional smile. In Jason's mind, Oliver didn't fit here. First class was reserved, in his view, for a certain kind of passenger. With a rigid posture and a voice laced with condescension, Jason approached Oliver, already determined to displace him. "Excuse me, sir," Jason said, his tone barely concealing his disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" He punctuated his words with a forced, overly polite smile that only thinly masked his judgment. Oliver glanced up, meeting Jason's gaze with a calm, unblinking confidence that, to any unbiased eye, would have commanded respect. Without a trace of defensiveness, he reached into his jacket and produced his boarding pass, extending it toward Jason. Jason barely looked at the pass before giving a dismissive nod. "This cabin is first class," he added, as if to underline the absurdity of Oliver's presence there. His hand subtly gestured toward the economy section, his meaning all too clear. "I'll have to ask you to move," he continued firmly, his voice leaving little room for protest. For a moment, Oliver held Jason's gaze, a flicker of disappointment crossing his expression, but he said nothing. He rose quietly, exuding the same dignity and calm with which he'd entered. Watching him, Jason felt a surge of satisfaction, believing he'd done his duty. But as Oliver walked down the aisle, he noticed the heads turning, passengers whispering, perhaps wondering why a man so clearly self-assured had been treated this way. Jason ignored the murmurs, dismissing them as he moved back to his station. To him, the matter was settled. But what Jason couldn't see was how drastically his own fate had shifted in that single interaction. The consequences of his actions, decisions rooted in his own narrow biases, would come crashing down on him within just 20 minutes. A twist of karma was already set in motion, one that would force him to face the prejudice he held so tightly, a lesson he would never forget. Jason, the lead flight attendant, prided himself on running a tight ship. Growing up in a disciplined household, he had learned early on that rules were the foundation of a well-ordered life. His father, a military man, and his mother, a retired teacher, had instilled in him a firm belief that people should know their place and follow the system without question. In their home, boundaries were respected and discipline was paramount, shaping Jason into a man who valued order, structure, and, above all, predictability. As a young adult, Jason had gravitated toward professions that required structure and routine. The aviation industry offered him exactly that: clear guidelines, a hierarchy, and a straightforward code of conduct. For Jason, the position of lead flight attendant was more than just a job. It was a stage on which he played the role of enforcer. He took pride in his authority, wearing his uniform as a badge of honor. To him, each flight was a microcosm of society, a space where he could ensure that order was maintained, boundaries were respected, and everyone knew their role. Over the years, however, Jason's commitment to these principles hardened into something less admirable. His rigid adherence to the rules began to morph into an intolerance for anything or anyone that didn't align with his worldview. He judged passengers quickly, often categorizing them by appearance, demeanor, or even seat selection. First class, to him, was reserved for an elite few, those who fit his narrow vision of success and sophistication. Anything that challenged his perception of normal behavior or status was met with scrutiny and a stubborn insistence on enforcing the rules. Jason's narrow outlook was reinforced by the stories he'd heard from his parents. His father, a man of conservative values, often spoke about how society was better when everyone adhered to their place and responsibilities. His mother, too, had been critical of people she saw as entitled or undeserving, and Jason had absorbed these biases unconsciously. He carried this mindset into his professional life, convinced that the world was divided into those who followed the rules and those who tried to bend them. In Jason's mind, his role as a flight attendant went beyond customer service. It was a duty to uphold the standards he'd set in his mind, a duty to ensure that only those he deemed worthy were afforded certain privileges. What Jason didn't recognize was how his biases had seeped into his interactions, affecting his judgment and creating a barrier between him and the people he served. He had become the kind of person who made assumptions at a glance, assessing people's worth based on superficial details. When he saw Oliver walk into the first-class cabin, his mind instantly began categorizing, judging. To him, Oliver's presence represented a challenge to the order he held so dear. Jason didn't see a successful, self-made man who had earned his place. He saw an anomaly, someone who didn't fit into his rigid structure of who belonged in first class. Despite his professionalism, Jason's biases were often visible in subtle ways. He would greet certain passengers with a more genuine smile, while others received a cursory nod. If someone dressed in a way he deemed unrefined, he might barely offer them eye contact. It wasn't that he was openly rude. Rather, he had mastered the art of passive disapproval, using slight inflections in his voice or small gestures to make his disdain known without saying it directly. For Jason, this was part of his method of control, a way to silently assert his standards without ever openly breaking protocol. In his personal life, Jason kept a small, carefully curated circle of friends, all of whom shared his structured lifestyle. He rarely strayed from routine and felt uncomfortable around people who didn't seem to follow his rules of respectability. He wasn't a man of spontaneity or open-mindedness. His world was one of predictability, a series of neatly arranged roles and expectations. Anything outside of that was, to him, a disruption, a threat to the order he valued so deeply. His coworkers noticed this rigidity, often joking that Jason could recite the entire flight attendant handbook from memory. Some even teased him for his by-the-book attitude, saying he was more of a rule enforcer than a host. But Jason took it as a compliment, believing that following the rules without exception was what separated good employees from great ones. In his eyes, the minor discomfort of passengers or colleagues was a small price to pay for ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Beneath his exterior of control and authority, however, was a layer of insecurity that Jason rarely acknowledged. His strict worldview was, in part, a defense mechanism. He had spent his whole life fitting into a mold that had been set for him, following a path that was as much a reflection of his parents' values as his own. Though he would never admit it, Jason felt threatened by people who embraced life with more freedom or flexibility. People like Oliver, who seemed confident and self-assured without fitting into his narrow definition of success, unsettled him. His insistence on following the rules and maintaining structure wasn't just a matter of personal preference. It was his way of asserting control in a world that often felt unpredictable and overwhelming. On some level, Jason was aware that his rigid mindset made him judgmental, that it created distance between himself and others. But rather than confront this, he doubled down on his beliefs, reinforcing his own self-righteousness. He told himself that he was simply doing his job, that the standards he held others to were not just personal preferences but professional necessities. By convincing himself that he was upholding a higher standard, he avoided facing the reality that his worldview was both limited and limiting. And so, when Oliver walked onto the plane that day, his presence immediately clashed with Jason's deeply ingrained biases. Here was a man who exuded success, yet didn't fit Jason's image of a first-class passenger. Jason didn't see Oliver's accomplishments or his right to be there. He saw only an affront to the orderly world he'd built in his mind. His reaction to Oliver was swift and almost reflexive, the culmination of years of rigid thinking and unconscious bias. Jason's actions toward Oliver were not an isolated incident but part of a pattern. Over time, his worldview had shaped him into a man who would rather uphold his own narrow standards than consider the experiences or achievements of others. To Jason, Oliver was not a person deserving of respect. He was an outlier, a disruption. And yet, Jason's narrow-mindedness would soon face its own reckoning. In dismissing Oliver, he had unwittingly set the stage for his own undoing, a lesson in humility and perspective that would challenge everything he believed about himself and the world he so rigidly sought to control. Jason settled into his usual pre-flight routine, meticulously checking every detail in the cabin with an almost obsessive precision. Each seat was straightened, each tray table secured, and each overhead compartment double-checked. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks 1,000 times, his movements almost mechanical. For Jason, this routine was not just a job requirement, but a ritual that brought him a sense of control and certainty. As he walked down the first-class aisle, he adjusted the pillows, smoothed out the blankets, and ensured that each seat was pristine. He took pride in maintaining a high standard, a habit ingrained from years of believing that order and respectability were paramount. Yet beneath this mask of professionalism was a simmering rigidity, a need to assert his authority over anything and anyone that seemed even slightly out of place. As passengers began boarding, Jason scanned them, quietly assessing each person with a critical eye. To him, first class wasn't just a section of the plane. It was a privilege reserved for those he deemed worthy. He noticed the business executives, the dignified older couples, and a few high-profile regulars he recognized from previous flights. These were passengers he trusted, people who fit his internal mold of deserving first-class travelers. Then he saw Oliver enter the cabin, dressed immaculately but exuding an aura that didn't sit well with Jason. He was younger than most of the passengers Jason was used to seeing in first class, with an effortless style and a relaxed confidence that felt, to Jason, almost challenging. Oliver's very presence seemed to question Jason's carefully structured world, and a seed of irritation took root in his mind. In his mind, Jason's thoughts turned critical as he took in Oliver's appearance. He's probably one of those show-offs, he thought, someone who thinks his money alone earns him respect. He found himself irritated by Oliver's calm demeanor, his ease, and the way he settled into his seat as though he belonged there. Jason's mind churned with assumptions, each one casting Oliver as an outsider in what Jason considered his own carefully curated environment. As Jason approached Oliver's seat, he noted with disdain how Oliver had already reclined his chair and placed his bag under his seat instead of in the overhead compartment, as was proper in first class. To Jason, these small actions were evidence of a lack of respect for the unspoken rules he held dear. In his mind, Oliver was not only intruding, but doing so with an air of entitlement. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line as he took in the scene, a sense of indignation bubbling beneath his professional facade. Jason cleared his throat, stepping into Oliver's line of sight with a practiced, authoritative stance. "Excuse me, sir," he said, keeping his tone cool but clipped. "I'll need you to place your bag in the overhead compartment. First-class passengers are expected to follow these guidelines." Oliver looked up, his expression calm and unfazed. He nodded, moving to comply without hesitation. "Of course," he replied, his voice polite and even. He shifted to lift his bag, but the courtesy in his response only served to deepen Jason's irritation. There was something about Oliver's composure that Jason found unsettling, as though his authority had somehow been brushed aside. As the plane continued to board, Jason found himself glancing at Oliver repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. He noticed Oliver greeting a flight attendant who was assisting another passenger, his manner warm and respectful. Watching this, Jason felt a pang of something uncomfortably close to jealousy. Oliver's presence was smooth, effortless, and authentic in a way that made Jason's rigid professionalism feel stilted and strained. Each polite nod, each quiet smile Oliver gave seemed to cast an unspoken judgment on Jason's unyielding adherence to rules. As boarding concluded and passengers settled in, Jason made another pass down the aisle, casting a critical eye over each seat, though his gaze kept drifting back to Oliver. He noticed how Oliver appeared relaxed, flipping through a magazine and nodding politely to the passenger next to him. The other passengers seemed charmed by his presence, their faces lighting up when he spoke. To Jason, this friendliness felt disruptive, a subtle unraveling of the controlled atmosphere he had worked so hard to maintain. The flight was nearly ready for takeoff when Jason felt an urge he couldn't ignore. He walked back to Oliver's seat, his mind racing with unvoiced justifications. "I'm just ensuring everything is in order," he told himself, trying to rationalize the scrutiny he directed at Oliver. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" Jason asked, his voice betraying a slight edge. Oliver, though slightly puzzled, handed over his boarding pass without question, his expression calm but slightly curious. Jason scrutinized the pass, searching for some discrepancy, any mistake that could justify his discomfort. But there was nothing. The seat was indeed his. Unable to find fault, Jason returned the boarding pass, feeling his frustration simmer beneath a forced smile. Oliver merely accepted it back with a quiet thank you, as though he hadn't noticed Jason's barely concealed suspicion. Jason's thoughts continued to spiral as he returned to his post. He acts as though he owns the place, Jason mused angrily, ignoring the fact that Oliver hadn't displayed any arrogance, only polite composure. But the judgment was already deeply lodged in Jason's mind, a narrative he'd built and was determined to believe. In his eyes, Oliver was a disruption, an undeserving intruder who was challenging the sanctity of first class merely by existing there. The tension grew thick as the plane began taxiing for takeoff. Jason's mind was so fixed on Oliver that he barely noticed the routine safety announcements he usually enforced with a watchful eye. His professionalism, usually so well honed, had been thrown off balance. He kept casting glances in Oliver's direction, searching for anything that could validate his prejudices. Each glance, however, only showed Oliver's calm demeanor, his complete lack of reaction to Jason's growing hostility, which only made Jason more irritated. The sense of unfairness lingered in the air, thick and tangible. Passengers around them remained unaware of the silent battle taking place between Jason's biases and Oliver's quiet dignity, but for Jason, the conflict was all-consuming. He could feel his frustration building, a growing certainty that something needed to be done to maintain what he believed was the natural order of things. In a moment of impulse, fueled by his escalating irritation, Jason took it upon himself to assert his authority once more. He approached Oliver with a forced smile that barely masked his disdain. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move. There's been a mistake with your seat assignment." The words came out smoothly, yet they held an edge of finality, as though Jason's will alone could make it true. Oliver looked up, a brief flicker of surprise crossing his face, but he recovered quickly, meeting Jason's gaze with a quiet strength that only further challenged the flight attendant's authority. "This is the seat I was assigned," Oliver said, his voice even, but firm. "I'm certain of that." But Jason, too entangled in his own assumptions and biases, saw this as nothing more than obstinance, a refusal to comply. "If you'll kindly move to the back, we can avoid further issues," he insisted, not realizing that his demand was drawing curious glances from other passengers nearby. The stage was set, the lines drawn between Jason's rigid view of who belonged and Oliver's quiet resistance to being diminished. The air was heavy with tension, a palpable anticipation of the conflict that had been building in Jason's mind. Unbeknownst to him, this single moment would be the turning point, the catalyst for the karmic reckoning that would soon unfold, revealing the limitations of his narrow worldview in ways he was completely unprepared for. Oliver had always been a man of quiet resilience. His journey to success was not something he flaunted, nor was it a simple tale of privilege and connections. He had built himself from the ground up, starting with humble beginnings in a small, close-knit community where hard work was as common as breathing. Raised by his mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep their household afloat, Oliver learned early on the value of perseverance, respect, and kindness. Despite the obstacles, he had pursued his education with passion, working countless odd jobs to pay his way through college and later through an MBA. Each achievement was hard-won, earned with an unyielding dedication that became the cornerstone of his character. Now, as a successful entrepreneur and one of the youngest founders of a tech company listed in Forbes, Oliver was proud of what he'd built. He was not only financially secure, but also committed to giving back, frequently mentoring young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Despite his accomplishments, he never lost sight of his roots or the principles his mother had instilled in him: humility, respect, and kindness. These values had shaped not only his career, but also the man he had become. On this particular flight, Oliver had hoped for a few hours of peace, time to catch up on reading, and perhaps review a few business reports he hadn't had the chance to address during his hectic week. He didn't need lavish treatment, in fact. He chose first class mainly for the quiet and the legroom, not for the status or luxury. It was a rare moment of self-care, a chance to regroup before his next set of meetings. As he settled into his seat, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, a brief respite. But that peace was quickly disrupted by Jason's unexpected hostility. When the flight attendant approached him with thinly veiled contempt, Oliver initially thought he was mistaken. Perhaps it was just a routine check, something minor. He had seen this before, occasional stares or double checks, but usually his calm demeanor and polite smile were enough to dispel any doubts others might have. However, as Jason's words grew more pointed, questioning his right to sit in first class, a familiar, unwelcome feeling crept into Oliver's chest. It was the feeling of being unfairly judged, of having his worth questioned because of factors beyond his control. Oliver had long ago learned to brush off these kinds of encounters, knowing that his success and his dignity spoke for themselves. Still, it hurt. No amount of success or wealth could shield him from the sting of someone's unwarranted assumptions. He felt the weight of Jason's gaze, scrutinizing him as though he were an imposter, as though the life he had built and the sacrifices he had made somehow didn't qualify him for this seat. Taking a steadying breath, he reminded himself of his mother's words, "Rise above it. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Yet, as Jason insisted that he move to the back, Oliver felt a flash of frustration. He had done everything right, booked his ticket, followed every rule, and still, he was being asked to leave his seat without reason. Despite his calm exterior, a storm brewed inside him. How many times had he worked twice as hard, been twice as patient, and still been met with suspicion simply because he didn't fit someone else's image of success? But as tempting as it was to react, Oliver held back, choosing to remain composed. Losing his temper would only validate Jason's prejudice, and he refused to give him that satisfaction. Inside, Oliver wrestled with a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't a new experience. It was just a stark reminder of how far society still had to go. He thought of the young people he mentored, how he always told them to keep their heads high and their values strong, even in the face of adversity. This was his chance to model that very resilience. So he maintained his quiet dignity, his voice steady and respectful, even as Jason continued to belittle him. When he offered his boarding pass as proof, hoping that this would resolve the issue, Jason dismissed it with barely a glance. The disrespect was palpable, and Oliver felt a pang of disappointment, not just in Jason, but in the larger reality this moment represented. Even as someone who had made it, he could not escape this kind of judgment. He wondered, painfully, if his success mattered at all in the eyes of someone who had already decided his worth based on nothing more than appearance. As he watched other passengers casting sympathetic glances, Oliver felt a flicker of validation, but also a hint of embarrassment. He didn't want to be pitied. He wanted to be respected. The frustration weighed on him, but he continued to hold his ground respectfully. He simply asked, "Why am I being asked to move? I followed all the procedures and have my ticket right here." His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of hurt that anyone paying attention could have noticed. Jason's response was cold, his tone dismissive. "This isn't your seat, sir. I'll need you to move now." In that moment, Oliver felt his patience thinning, the familiar ache of unfairness becoming almost unbearable. But he reminded himself that he had nothing to prove to Jason or anyone else. He had earned his place here, not just on this plane, but in every room he'd ever walked into. And if Jason couldn't see that, it was Jason's failure, not his. This experience left Oliver feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way that he hadn't felt in years. For all his accomplishments, for all his success, he was still subject to the biases of others. But even as he processed this familiar hurt, he resolved not to let it diminish his dignity. He would rise above, just as his mother had taught him. Jason might see him as undeserving, but Oliver knew his own worth. He was more than his seat on this flight, more than anyone's assumptions about him. And while Jason's prejudice stung, Oliver would carry himself with the same quiet strength that had brought him this far. In that moment, Oliver decided that he wouldn't let this incident go unaddressed, not out of vengeance, but as a matter of principle. No one should be made to feel lesser for being who they are, for existing outside someone's narrow expectations. He would ensure that Jason understood the consequences of his actions, not to punish, but to enlighten. Oliver hoped that by standing firm in his truth, he could be a reminder to everyone on that plane of the importance of respect, no matter a person's appearance, background, or quiet dignity. If you're watching this and feel for Oliver's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from today. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt unfairly judged? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore real-life issues and justice served. As the plane settled into cruising altitude, Jason allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Oliver had finally moved, and Jason felt that his precious first-class cabin was back in order. He prided himself on maintaining high standards, and in his mind, he had simply upheld those values. But he was about to discover that his actions had set off a chain of events beyond his control, events that would unravel the certainty he held so tightly. It began subtly. Jason noticed a few of the first-class passengers casting disapproving glances his way, whispering to each other, their expressions tinged with disbelief. He brushed it off, thinking they were merely reacting to the unusual situation. Yet, as he continued his rounds, he overheard fragments of their conversations, words like unfair, overreach, and unprofessional echoing through the aisle. Jason felt a twinge of irritation, but he quickly buried it. They don't know the full story, he thought, and they certainly don't know what's best for this cabin. As the flight continued, one of the passengers, a well-dressed older woman who had observed the incident, flagged him down. "Excuse me, young man," she began, her voice stern. "What you did back there to that gentleman was highly inappropriate. He had every right to sit in first class." Jason stiffened, caught off guard. He straightened his posture, giving her his practiced smile. "I'm sorry if there was any misunderstanding, ma'am, but I was only following protocol." The woman's gaze remained unyielding. "Protocol? That man presented his ticket, and you still asked him to move. That's not protocol. That's prejudice." Her words landed heavily, stirring an uncomfortable feeling within him, but he clung to his defensive stance, nodding curtly before walking away. His cheeks felt hot with embarrassment, but he pushed it aside, telling himself he had done nothing wrong. Yet the murmurs of discontent only grew louder. More passengers began looking at him with open disapproval, and several of them whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the back where Oliver was now seated. The longer the flight went on, the more Jason felt his composure slipping. Normally, he reveled in the respect that came with his role, but now, each disapproving look chipped away at his confidence, replacing his sense of authority with a creeping sense of unease. It didn't end there. A fellow flight attendant approached him in the galley with a concerned look. "Jason," she said quietly, "some passengers are really upset about how you treated that man in first class. I heard one of them say they plan to report this to the airline." Jason's stomach twisted. "Report me?" he scoffed, though his voice wavered slightly. "For what? I was just doing my job." She gave him a sympathetic but firm look. "Jason, you need to realize how this looks. He was respectful, showed his ticket, and did nothing wrong. People are seeing it as discrimination, and honestly, it's hard to disagree." Jason felt a surge of defensiveness. "Discrimination? That's ridiculous. I follow the same protocol with everyone." But even as he spoke, he felt a growing discomfort. He could sense the shift in the atmosphere. His once carefully controlled domain felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He didn't want to admit it, but his fellow flight attendant's words lingered in his mind. For the first time, he began to wonder if perhaps he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. Then the announcement came over the intercom, crackling through the speakers with a surprising urgency. "Attention passengers, this is your captain speaking. Due to some unexpected turbulence ahead, we're going to have to request that all passengers and crew members remain seated with seatbelts fastened until further notice." As Jason took his seat, the weight of the morning's events settled heavily on him. Turbulence wasn't new to him, but today, the jolt of the plane seemed to mirror the unsettling turmoil he was feeling inside. The normally brief bouts of turbulence stretched on, growing increasingly erratic. He clutched his armrests, his thoughts turning inward. For once, he couldn't escape his own mind, which replayed the encounter with Oliver and the passengers' criticisms over and over. After a long stretch, the turbulence finally subsided, and Jason went back to his duties, though he felt less assured than before. As he returned to the aisle, he found himself avoiding eye contact with the passengers who had witnessed the scene. His usual confidence was replaced by a gnawing sense of vulnerability that he couldn't shake. Then, as he passed through the economy cabin, he spotted Oliver seated quietly, a book open in his hands, seemingly unbothered by the turbulence or the commotion that had followed their exchange. Despite everything, Oliver had chosen to stay composed, retaining a dignity that only served to highlight Jason's own lack of it. For a brief moment, Jason felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't just undermined a passenger's experience. He disrespected someone who had done nothing to deserve it. As the flight neared its destination, Jason's discomfort transformed into dread. Word had spread among the passengers, and he'd overheard snippets of conversations, some speculating on whether Oliver might take action against the airline, others expressing their own outrage over the incident. Each comment felt like a stone dropped into his stomach, and by the time they were preparing for descent, Jason could barely focus on his tasks. Once they landed, Jason hoped to quietly exit and move past the incident, but his supervisor, who had received several complaints, was waiting at the gate. She pulled him aside, her face a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Jason," she began, her voice low but firm, "I've just spoken with several passengers who reported what happened on this flight. They were deeply disturbed by your actions." Jason's defenses went up immediately, but he felt the weight of the supervisor's gaze, steady and unrelenting. "I was only trying to maintain order," he mumbled, though even to his own ears, the excuse sounded hollow. "I'm not sure that's how it looked to others," she replied pointedly. "Discrimination isn't something we tolerate here, Jason. I'm afraid I'll need to document this incident in your file, and I'm placing you on temporary leave pending an investigation." The word discrimination struck him harder than he expected, each syllable echoing painfully in his mind. This was not just a reprimand. It was a reflection of something darker, something Jason had been avoiding for years. The walls he had built with his rigid worldview were crumbling, and he was left facing the uncomfortable truth about the bias that had influenced his actions. As he walked away from the gate, the full impact of his actions began to settle in. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his adherence to the rules, but now he was forced to confront the reality that his standards had blinded him to his own prejudices. The judgment he had so readily placed on Oliver had now fallen upon him, and he could feel the sting of shame that came with it. Over the next few days, Jason found himself in an uncharacteristic state of introspection. With his duties suspended, he had little to do but reflect on what had happened. He replayed every detail of that flight in his mind, questioning not only his actions, but also the beliefs that had shaped them. He realized, painfully, that he had dismissed Oliver without a thought simply because he didn't fit into the narrow image Jason had constructed of who belonged in first class. The consequences of his actions continued to ripple outward. News of the incident spread throughout the airline, and Jason's colleagues began to distance themselves, some even expressing their disappointment. For the first time, Jason felt isolated in a way he hadn't anticipated. His certainty, once a source of pride, had been shattered, leaving him to confront the uncomfortable reality of his own biases. In a moment of clarity, Jason realized that he could no longer hide behind his old justifications. His initial resistance had given way to an undeniable truth. He had judged Oliver unfairly, and the fallout was a direct consequence of that judgment. The shame he felt was profound, touching parts of him he'd never examined. He had to face the reality of who he had become, a man whose rigid beliefs had caused harm, a man who now had to decide whether he would continue down this path or confront the prejudices he had long held unchallenged. In the days following his suspension, Jason's world felt strangely hollow. The routine he'd clung to for years had been stripped away, leaving him with more time than he knew what to do with. At first, he paced his small apartment, still grappling with the humiliation of his suspension and the reality that his rigid worldview had led to this low point. The feedback from his supervisors had been painfully clear. His actions were viewed as discriminatory, and his refusal to listen to Oliver's explanations had alienated not only the passengers, but also his colleagues. With no work to escape to, Jason had nothing left but his own thoughts. Desperate for a distraction, Jason decided to take a walk in his neighborhood, but even in the bustle of the city, he felt alone, aware for the first time of how isolated he'd become by his own actions. As he wandered, he stumbled across a flyer posted on a community bulletin board. It read, "Volunteers needed. Help serve at local shelter." The words seemed to jump out at him, offering a lifeline. Volunteering wasn't something he'd ever considered. Yet he felt compelled to do something that would reconnect him with people in a different way. Taking a deep breath, Jason took down the number and decided he would give it a try. The following week, Jason arrived at the shelter, feeling out of place and uncertain. The coordinator, a warm woman named Linda, welcomed him with a kind smile. "You're here to help? Wonderful. We could always use more hands," she said, handing him an apron and showing him around. His first task was to help serve lunch, something he'd never done before. As he filled plates and handed them to guests, he felt a strange mix of discomfort and humility. Here, he was just another volunteer, no uniform or authority to separate him from everyone else. At first, Jason found himself silently comparing the guests to the passengers he'd served on flights, feeling an instinctive urge to assess and categorize them. But gradually, as he served meals and saw the gratitude in their faces, he began to understand that these people were just like anyone else, each with a story he couldn't see at first glance. The more he helped, the more he realized how limited his worldview had been, shaped by assumptions he now recognized as flawed. One day, while helping to organize donated clothing, Jason found himself chatting with a man named David, a regular at the shelter who had recently lost his job. David spoke about the challenges he faced trying to find work, the constant judgment he felt from people who looked at him only as someone struggling, not as a person with aspirations and worth. Listening to David, Jason felt a pang of recognition. David's experiences mirrored the assumptions he'd held about Oliver. He'd only seen the surface and had ignored the person underneath. The next few weeks saw Jason returning to the shelter regularly. He found solace in the work, but more importantly, he found his perspective shifting. Conversations with the guests gave him insights he'd never considered, each story adding depth to his understanding of the human experience. Through David and others, he began to see how easy it was to judge without knowing the full story, and he felt a growing sense of empathy, a compassion that had been absent from his life for too long. One afternoon, Linda asked him to sit in on a community discussion about prejudice and assumptions, hosted by a local advocacy group. Jason hesitated, feeling a pang of shame at the thought of facing such topics so directly. But something pushed him to attend, and as he listened to speakers share stories of prejudice and discrimination, he recognized himself in their words. The unconscious biases, the quick judgments, the sense of entitlement, all these traits, once part of his professional identity, now felt like weights he needed to shed. After the session, Jason approached one of the speakers, a man named Martin who spoke passionately about the impact of racial bias in everyday life. Swallowing his pride, Jason shared his own story, admitting the mistakes he had made on the flight with Oliver. Martin listened patiently, nodding thoughtfully. "You know," Martin said, "the fact that you're here, acknowledging it, is the first step. But real change means continuing to work on it. Biases don't just disappear. It takes effort, honesty, and a willingness to learn." Determined to continue his growth, Jason sought out books and resources on unconscious bias, prejudice, and empathy. He spent hours reading, highlighting passages that resonated with him, and reflecting on how his worldview had been shaped by biases he hadn't even recognized. These were moments of quiet reckoning, the walls of defensiveness he'd built over the years slowly breaking down as he confronted uncomfortable truths about himself. He understood now that change would be a continuous journey, and he was ready to embrace it. One day, while walking through his neighborhood, Jason saw a group of teens gathered around a community basketball court. Normally, he would have passed by without a second thought, but something pulled him to watch them play. As he stood there, he remembered his own teenage years, the way he'd once looked at the world with wonder before life had hardened his views. Approaching them, he offered to help with coaching, something he hadn't done before but felt compelled to try. The teens welcomed him, and over the next few months, he found himself spending time with them regularly, mentoring them, learning from their perspectives, and seeing the world through fresh eyes. During one of their sessions, he shared his experience on the flight, the mistakes he'd made, and the lesson he was still learning. The teens listened intently, and when he finished, one of them, a young man named Caleb, said, "Everyone makes mistakes. It's about what you do after that counts." Jason nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He was beginning to understand the true value of humility, of learning from those around him, and accepting that he didn't have all the answers. As the weeks turned into months, Jason felt compelled to reach out to Oliver, to apologize for his actions directly. Through a colleague, he was able to obtain Oliver's contact information, and with a mixture of apprehension and sincerity, he composed an email explaining his journey, admitting his mistakes, and asking for a chance to meet and offer a genuine apology. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped that by showing Oliver the depth of his remorse, he could at least take responsibility for the harm he'd caused. To his surprise, Oliver responded, agreeing to meet him. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, and as Jason waited, he felt his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. When Oliver arrived, Jason stood, extending his hand, which Oliver accepted, albeit cautiously. Sitting down, Jason took a deep breath, recounting his journey of self-reflection, his volunteer work, and the lessons he'd learned. "I can't undo what I did," Jason admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I acted out of ignorance, out of arrogance, and I've been working hard to make sure I never treat anyone that way again." Oliver listened intently, his expression softened but unreadable. When Jason finished, there was a long pause before Oliver spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Jason," he said, his tone steady and calm. "It takes courage to admit your mistakes, but remember, it's a lifelong journey. Changing yourself isn't a one-time thing, it's a commitment." Jason nodded, grateful for Oliver's words. He had come to understand that true redemption wasn't about a single act of apology, but about the continued efforts to live up to a new standard, one built on empathy and respect. As they parted ways, Jason felt a sense of closure, but also a newfound dedication to continue on this path of growth. In the months that followed, Jason embraced his journey of change, becoming a vocal advocate for understanding and respect within his community. He attended workshops, participated in discussions, and continued volunteering at the shelter, knowing that his commitment to change would be measured not by grand gestures, but by the small, consistent actions that reflected his growth. He returned to work eventually, carrying a new perspective with him, one that allowed him to serve every passenger with a genuine respect he'd never felt before. His colleagues noticed the change, many of them quietly acknowledging his transformation. Jason no longer wore his uniform as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of his responsibility to treat every person with dignity. He knew he would face challenges, that old biases might resurface, but he was ready, grounded in the humility and empathy he'd gained along the way. Jason's journey towards self-realization was far from over, but he had taken the first, most crucial steps. He had learned to look beyond the surface, to question his own assumptions, and to value the humanity in everyone he encountered. And as he continued down this path, he knew he was finally becoming the person he'd always aspired to be, someone worthy of respect, not because of his uniform or position, but because of the integrity he carried in his heart. Months had passed since Jason's transformation journey began. He had spent countless hours volunteering at the shelter, mentoring teens in his community, and continuously reflecting on his actions and biases. Slowly, he rebuilt his sense of purpose, shaped now by humility and a genuine desire to connect with people rather than control them. His colleagues noticed the change, and while some were initially skeptical, most came to respect the sincere shift in his demeanor and values. Jason was no longer the strict, by-the-book flight attendant. He was now approachable, compassionate, and respected in a way he had never experienced before. One day, Jason received an unexpected email from Oliver, inviting him to an event that Oliver's Mentorship Foundation was hosting. The foundation, which supported young people from underprivileged backgrounds, was celebrating its anniversary, and Jason felt both surprised and deeply touched by the invitation. He saw it as an opportunity not only to support a cause he now felt connected to, but also as a sign that Oliver had truly recognized the depth of his growth. On the day of the event, Jason arrived at the community center, a simple yet welcoming space filled with laughter, music, and the sounds of children playing. He looked around, taking in the atmosphere, feeling a renewed sense of appreciation for the kindness and resilience of people who had faced much more challenging paths than his own. Just as he was about to take a seat, he heard a familiar voice behind him, Jason. Turning around, he saw Oliver standing there, a warm smile on his face. Jason extended his hand, but Oliver surprised him by pulling him into a hug, a gesture that filled Jason with a deep sense of relief and gratitude. It felt like an unspoken acknowledgement, a symbol of the bridge they had finally built between them. "It means a lot that you came today," Oliver said, releasing him and nodding toward the bustling crowd around them. "These young people here, they're incredible. They have so much potential, and all they need is a chance, just like so many of us did." Jason nodded, feeling a wave of understanding wash over him. "Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, really," he said sincerely, glancing around the room. "I can see how much of a difference you're making." The two spent time talking to the young people and other mentors at the event, with Oliver occasionally introducing Jason to others, never hesitating to include him in conversations. Jason felt accepted, not just by Oliver, but by the community Oliver had fostered. These were people who welcomed him, not because of his role or title, but because they sensed the genuine respect and humility he now carried with him. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Oliver took the stage to give a brief speech, thanking everyone for their support and dedication to the Foundation's mission. He spoke about the importance of empathy, resilience, and the power of second chances. As Jason listened, he realized just how closely those themes resonated with his own journey. Before stepping down, Oliver added, "We're all here today because someone, at some point, believed in us, even when we didn't deserve it. And we're here to give others that same opportunity." His eyes briefly met Jason's in the crowd, and Jason felt a swell of emotion at the unspoken words in that glance. It was a reminder of the forgiveness and trust that Oliver had extended to him, even after the way he'd acted. After the speech, several people approached Jason, asking about his work with the shelter and the community basketball program he'd started with the teens. It was a moment of pride, not in his accomplishments, but in the connections he was building and the meaningful ways he was now contributing. He no longer felt the need to control or judge. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude to be part of something larger than himself. As he left the event that night, Jason reflected on how far he had come. He felt at peace with himself, his purpose grounded in genuine connection and compassion. His actions had earned him respect, but more importantly, they had given him a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The next day back at work, Jason was greeted by his colleagues with warm smiles and nods of acknowledgement. His supervisor, who had once reprimanded him, stopped by to commend him on his growth. "It's good to have you back, Jason," she said. "You're a different person, and it shows. The passengers notice it too." On his next flight, Jason found himself in the first-class cabin, assisting a diverse group of passengers, each with their unique stories. He welcomed each one with genuine warmth, no longer feeling the impulse to categorize or judge. He knew now that every person on his flight deserved respect, not because of their status, but because they were human beings with intrinsic worth. As he made his way down the aisle, he spotted a young boy, no older than 12, looking slightly nervous as he settled into his first-class seat next to his mother. Jason smiled at him and leaned down, making eye contact. "First time flying in first class?" he asked gently, his tone reassuring. The boy nodded, and Jason continued, "Well, I hope you enjoy it. You're right where you belong." The boy's face lit up with a shy smile, and Jason felt a deep sense of fulfillment in that simple moment, realizing he had finally shed the judgments that had once held him back. For Jason, it was more than just a job now. It was a way to honor the journey he'd been on, the lessons he'd learned, and the forgiveness he'd been shown. His redemption was not a single event, but an ongoing process of empathy, growth, and giving back. He had finally found his place, not in enforcing order, but in fostering understanding and respect. In that moment, Jason knew he had truly been transformed, and as he moved forward, he carried with him the commitment to live up to the second chance he'd been given, a chance that had allowed him to become the best version of himself, one he was now proud to share with the world. If you found Jason's journey of redemption inspiring, don't miss our next story. It's another tale of justice, resilience, and unexpected second chances. Click here to watch a story that will touch your heart and remind you of the power of forgiveness and growth. Be sure to subscribe for more stories that dive deep into real-life issues and life-changing lessons. See you in the next video.